Welcome back. In the previous video, we created a function called setItemProperties that does a switch on the item state, and based on that state, it sets the properties for the various components of the item. And we said that we're going to implement different cases as those states are implemented. In this video, we're going to create a function that allows us to drop our weapon, or at least detach it from the mesh. So we're going to create a function called drop weapon and handle taking the weapon out of our hands so that we can no longer have that weapon equipped. So let's go ahead and jump into shooterCharacter.h and create a function up in the protected section. We're going to call this function drop weapon. It'll be a void function. So let's say drop weapon, and we can comment this function and say detach weapon and let it fall to the ground. Okay, let's give this function a function definition. And here in drop weapon, what we'd like to do is first check to see if we have a weapon equipped, because we're only going to drop a weapon if it's the currently equipped weapon. So let's say if equipped weapon, then we can detach that weapon. So we're going to use the function called detach from component, and that's going to be on the mesh of the weapon. So we're going to need to get the item mesh from equipped weapon. In item.h, down in our public section, we're going to want to add a public getter for our mesh. So let's create a force inline function that's going to return a uSkeletal mesh component. That's a pointer. And it's going to be called get item mesh. It's going to be const, and it's going to return item mesh. So now we can get that from within the character class. So let's go back to shooter character, and we're going to get the equipped weapon. We're going to call get item mesh, and from the item mesh, then we'll call detach from component. Now the detach from component requires an f detachment transform rules, so we're going to have to create a local variable of that type. So it's f detachment transform rules. So we can call this detachment transform rules, and we can initialize it. So we have to initialize it using an enum constant of type e detachment rule. And we can use keep relative or keep world. And we're going to want the weapon to keep its world transform. So we're going to use keep world. And then there's a Boolean called incall modify, and we're going to set that to true. So we'll give this a semicolon. Now I've got the documentation here for f detachment transform rules, and it says that this b call modify says whether to call modify on the components concerned when detaching. And if you look at the documentation for uObject modify, it just says note that the object will be modified. So we're noting that the object will be modified. So now in our call to detach from component, we can pass in detachment transform rules. So far in drop weapon, all we do is detach our mesh. So we can see how this works by setting up some input so that we can perform a key press and calling this function to make sure that it's detaching our weapon. So why don't we set up an action mapping for this? So back here in the editor, I'm going to edit and project settings, and I'm going to go to inputs and create a new action mapping. Now I'm going to designate a button for selecting objects. This button will result in us picking things up, or maybe opening doors, or anything like that. And so I'm going to call this action mapping select, and I'm going to assign this to a key for the keyboard. Why not the E key? Because it's right there next to the W key. So if we're using WSAD, our index finger can easily reach up and press it. Now, I'd also like to use a gamepad face button for our console controller. So let's add another one and let's type in gamepad face button and let's use the left button. That's going to be the X button on an Xbox and the square button on a PS4 controller. So we've got this action mapping called select. We can close project settings. I'm going to click save all. So back here in shooter character.h, we can create a couple of functions that can be used to bind to our new select action mapping. So let's call these void select button pressed and void select button released. Okay, so let's create function bodies for these. And now that we have some callback functions, we can set these up in setup player input component. So I'm going to copy these two calls to bind action for our aiming button, and I'm going to paste them here. And instead of aiming button, I'm going to use the select axis mapping name for both of them. Now for select pressed, we're going to call select button pressed. And for select released, we're going to call select button released. And finally, we can add some logic to these functions. I'm going to go ahead and go to select button pressed. And all I'm going to do for now is call drop weapon. So as soon as we hit that E key or the face button left, we'll just get drop weapon called. And that should result in detaching our weapon. So let's go ahead and give this a test by compiling. Okay, so we're going to hit play, and I'm going to press the E key. And there we have it. Our weapon has detached and is no longer in the hands of the character. So in the next video, we're going to handle putting that weapon into the falling state and making it fall to the ground. So stay tuned and see you in the next video.